In this video, I want to discuss my favorite Sony FX3 camera settings to best suit your next video production. Stick around to the end for a little baby gift and subscribe so you guys can see whenever I release new videos. What makes a video even look cinematic? A few aspects that help something look cinematic are lighting, lenses, camera, shallow depth of field, camera placement, and a few other things that we'll discuss in future videos, but I just want to kind of keep this more camera focused for this one. A technique that I really enjoy doing is something called stacking the frame. Stacking a frame is something I like to do to help the viewer feel like they're getting let into my cinematic eye/world. I put something in the foreground to give depth and interest. When I'm shooting, I'll find something to put in front of the camera and I work off that to build my shot. It also helps whenever I'm trying to shoot B-roll. It just, it gives more interest to your frame. Choosing the right frame rate and shutter speed. Another thing that I really appreciate about Sony cameras is that even though the camera has been out for a few years, they're still sending out updates, which is really great for the consumer. And one of those features that they added with the software update is shutter angle, which in a lot of ways, it eliminates the need to even have to really think about shutter speed in certain situations, I guess. But in short, when shooting a video, you want to double your shutter speed from your frame rate. So if you're shooting 24 frames a second, you want to at least shoot 50 shutter speed. 60 frames a second, you would double that, so that would be at least 120 shutter speed. The cool thing about shooting shutter angle is that having shutter angle will double your frame rate no matter what frame rate that you're shooting in. So let's say you chose 24 frames a second. If your shutter angle is at 180, it will automatically double that, so you don't even need to adjust your shutter speed. And if you're shooting slow motion, it will automatically double it if you're at 180 shutter angle at 60 frames a second. So if you're switching really fast between these different frame rates, you don't even have to touch your shutter speed, which is very helpful for running and gunning or being able to change your frame rate at a really fast rate. That doesn't really make sense. Whatever. There's a few other things that you want to think about whenever you're figuring out your shutter speed. Whenever you're slowing your shutter speed down, it's gonna have a drag effect. If you speed it up, it's gonna have a more fast, jagged effect. So if you look at movies like The Bourne Identity, they crank their shutter speed higher because those fight scenes look more dynamic and cinematic whenever people are fighting and stuff. But if you wanna have maybe you have somebody at a party and they're drunk, you can slow your shutter speed down and it will have a fun drag effect. So my challenge to you is to just play around with different shutter angles and see what might fit a certain shot that you're getting or a stylistic choice for a video that you're making. I've noticed with cameras that have rolling shutter like the FX3, generally if you're gonna crank your shutter speed to 2000 or 1500, it's gonna look pretty jittery, which I don't super love. So I try to keep my shutter angle at just 180 whenever I'm shooting, unless I'm doing a more stylized slow shutter shot. But yeah, just be careful cranking your shutter speed on these cameras because in certain aspects, it just looks pretty jarring. Using the right picture profile. For a while, whenever I shot with my Sony a7S II back in the day, whenever I filmed weddings, I would, for the most part, stay away from log profiles because I could not figure out how to color grade it, and you had to expose it in such a certain way for it to feel good at all. But with the Sony FX3, it's become way more easy to judge exposure when shooting with a log color profile. I shoot an SLOG 3 Sony EI, and that's the same color pipeline that their Sony Burano shoots in, their Sony Venice 2 shoots in. So it makes it really easy to shoot between those different cameras and easily match your color grade. And whenever you're shooting in that color profile, I have a hotkey setup that I'm gonna show you guys later where I can instantly switch from ISO 800 to ISO 12800, which is the second base ISO built into the camera. I would recommend shooting in this color profile because you're gonna get the most dynamic range and you're gonna have the most latitude whenever you go and color grade the image in post. The importance of lighting. A big part of making your images look good is lighting. I've seen so many people use terrible cameras and get great results. I don't want to go too far into lighting in this video. That's going to be another video that I have coming up in a few weeks. But I do want to give you guys a small tool that I use whenever I am thinking about lighting. Whenever I walk into a room, I see where the light is hitting. Is it daylight? Is it warmer because of the sunset? Or is it cooler because it's evening? And I also use this awesome color temperature app that helps me see exactly what the temperature is that is coming into a room or off of a light, so I can easily match that natural light to a light that I'm setting up. But try to use this technique. Walk into rooms and just pay attention to how the light is naturally falling and see if you can recreate that. So here's a rundown of my camera settings. I have my record button as obviously the record button, but I also have this shutter button as record as well. So if I'm hand holding it and I don't want to have to reposition my finger to the record button, I could just hit the shutter and it starts recording. As my ISO button, number 3, I have the switch between 800 ISO to the other base ISO of 12,800. One click button, very easily. My number 1 button is set to frame rate, so I can switch really fast between 30, 24, and 60 frames a second. And if you have shutter angle, you won't have to even change your shutter angle switching between frame rates. So very fast and efficient. Number 2 is my white balance, obviously. Number 2, WB. I didn't want to change that for confusion. My function button, I can change between active stabilization, standard, and off. I keep it in active. My function button is the same. I didn't customize that. I usually use this level whenever I'm composing a shot because I just don't want to make sure that I'm off axis. The left press is the zebras. Up press is changing the display options. Number 4, the trash can button down here. I can switch my monitor brightness between sunny weather and normal. So if I'm shooting outside, I can quickly hop between those. My right button is my peaking, which it's already labeled that, so I just wanted to keep that the same. I also have this center button to zoom in and quickly check my focus. And I have my down button to change my different LUTs. And lastly, we'll go into where I actually customize which button is which. You go to the toolbox, and then you go to Operation Customize, Video Customization, and these are all of my settings. I'm blocking all my light. Well, sometimes life happens and you have to jump on a 2-hour meeting. Whoops. Composition and camera movement. There's a few different options for rigging your camera for shooting. Today, I want to focus on 3: handheld, gimbal, and tripod. When I'm wanting to be very intentional with my framing, I like to use the tripod. I try to imagine if I am at a museum and I'm looking at a painting, like how can I compose my shot where it can live in that world? So generally, I'll shoot in real time, 24 frames a second. And the reason I go with 24 frames a second is because your mind registers around 24 images in a second, so it looks the closest to your eye, and it ends up being the most cinematic in my opinion. The next piece of equipment that I'll use is a gimbal. I like to follow the action with a gimbal. I use the DJI Ronin 4, and it's seriously such a great tool. Paired with the autofocus system of the Sigma 24-70 that I'm actually shooting this with, I really do enjoy using an autofocus lens with the gimbal because it makes it easier to get more shots without having to stop and refocus. Or I'll also use the DJI LiDAR system, which I haven't fully tricked out with my setup, but I will soon, and that's another video coming your way. Whenever I'm using the gimbal, I'll jump between 24 and 60 frames a second. If I'm trying to get a nice like sliding left to right shot on the gimbal, I'll usually put it in like 60 frames a second. It makes it easy to have more usable B-roll shots whenever you're shooting slow motion with that gimbal. The last of the 3 camera movements that I typically go with is handheld. And handheld you have to be very careful with because it can be a crutch for a lot of filmmakers. Whenever I'm shooting with the FX3, I'll put on active image stabilization, and it really does help work out those micro jitters. And if I'm shooting handheld, I'll typically go between 24, 60, and 120 frames a second. The FX3, like I said, the rolling shutter is not amazing, so you have to kind of figure out what's the specific way that I'm gonna hold the camera. What I've learned is that if I rig my camera out, I put a V-mount on the back of it, a top handle, and a monitor, it helps with the micro jitters because you're taking your hands further away from the sensor onto different parts of the camera. So it just helps, and it makes your handheld footage look a little less crappy. So now, we'll talk about the importance of ND filters. It's actually getting darker, so I don't even need this one anymore. Wow, there I am. Enhancing your footage with veritable ND filters. If you're shooting outdoors and you have a crap ton of light hitting your sensor, you're gonna say, wait, Seth, I can't shoot the correct shutter angle / shutter speed because everything is overexposed. If you run into this issue, you'll need to use something like an ND filter or a veritable ND filter. It's also very important that you invest into filters that won't have a crazy color shift, because there are so many ND filters out there that are like 20 bucks and it's gonna make your footage look like dog shit. This is the veritable ND filter by Peter McKinnon, and it's 2 to 5 stops of ND. And if I'm shooting outside in the super bright days, I'll use my 6 to 9 veritable ND filter. For my dual lens primes, I have the Mophage E to PL mount adapter with the veritable ND filter built into the mount, because it's easier for me to switch between different lenses and not have to unscrew the veritable ND filter off the front of the lens. I could just have it straight onto the mount. I know it's very annoying to have to invest into so many things with filmmaking, but just make sure that you invest into good ND filters, because you don't want to have to buy twice. I've done that, and let me just save you a few extra $100 and just encourage you not to do that. And all the links to all these products are in the description below. And if you have any comments, please just leave them in the comment section and I will get back to all of them. I hope. So the gift I wanted to give you guys is a LUT that I've been using to convert my log footage to color. So enjoy and download and subscribe as a thank you. Give it a thumbs up and, I don't know, maybe share it with your friends. Wow, it's so bright now. Dear Lord, it's gonna make the intro not look consistent. I'm gonna close that window a little bit. It's a little too dark. It's a little too dark now. A little too dark.